ask that you share this information, this moment with them as well. Giving you thanks for the beauty of being among friends, brothers, and sisters, asking for your blessing, and so be it. We are sorry for the little delay here as we were reading before, but as I always like to say, it is very easy to kickstart something, right? To start a project and and we're always excited, right? But Kirsten know what I'm talking about. The hardest thing is to keep on, to march on. And I like to say this because I have done the same. Many others have done the same of really studying and bringing the studies of a specific book for us, right, for one another, and especially when we have to apply for ourselves. So kudos to Kirsten to give a continuation to this amazing book. We are now on part 2, chapter 7, entitled Maturity and Conscientiousness. And the book is Times of Health and Conscientiousness. So with no further ado, Kirsten, please.
This is my mic? Yes? Okay. That's okay. Okay. Take 2. Good afternoon, everyone. So do not think me a lazy individual sitting on a chair. Well, yeah, but due to my physical condition, um, yeah, just makes it easier for physical reasons. Okay, we are living in a physical body. Good afternoon. So good to see everybody. Today, as Leo said, we are continuing on the study of this book. And yes, definitely, whenever we undertake a new project in the beginning, we're so excited. Like, oh yeah, you have all the feelings and you envision all the good things. And then like the further and more as time goes on, you're like, okay, some things feel like monotonous, and we try to spice it up and make it more interesting and more tangible. And this chapter is called Maturity and Conscientiousness. And before we dive deep into it, I wanted to share recently something happened. Happens to all of us at some point in our lives, where we have somebody who we love and adore and who's such a huge part of our lives, and they die. They pass on. And I don't know if who has experienced that yet, but when that does happen, as much as we are spiritists and we believe in that life goes on, it's always seems surreal when it happens. Again, this is our personal experience. Maybe I'm sure it's different for everyone, but the 2 times it's happened in my life with 2 people, one of which was my father a number of years ago, it feels like a dream in the beginning. And I'll get to my point of how this connects to the talk. So my mother's best friend of 40 years, who lived here in the States, and truly somebody who knew all the ins and outs, all the dirty little secrets of the family, everything. Okay? In Portuguese, you say, like, when you, what is it? You eat a pound or a kilo of salt with someone, like all those things, right? So she recently passed away, and it was very surreal. And I was, talking to my siblings about this woman who was such a huge part of our lives growing up. And still to this day, thinking about her life, how she lived it in such a humble way, but always being a dedicated wife and mother. And and she passed away. And we were thinking about how that affects all of us. And that's kind of where this idea of maturity comes in. When something like death knocks on our door, it really can hit us, can really awaken us, in a sense, to what is important, what really matters. You know, am I living my life the best way that I should? It really makes us reevaluate things. It's one thing when we know of others, you know, when a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend passes away, you know, or a neighbor or someone who, you know, we're connected to by 6 degrees of separation, if you will. It's sad. We pray for them. But it's a different experience when it's you, when you're the one who has to feel it. And so it changes us. And so in life, we have these moments, these opportunities for us to grow. And so today, I wanted to approach this chapter in a different way, as we generally like to, because the way that Joanna breaks down this chapter is essentially this. She says maturity and conscientiousness, right? They go hand in hand. That we can physically go from being a baby, you know, go through all the stages of like a toddler and becoming a child and becoming a young adult or a teenager, then a young adult and adult. We can grow physically, yet emotionally and psychologically, we remain in childhood. So I'll give you, for instance, have you ever met someone who was older? I mean, let's just say I'm in my 40s, so 40 is not old. So somebody who's like in their 80s, who's old, who's really seems immature in a sense. But then you know someone who is really young and you meet them and you say things like, oh, this person's an old soul. Like they just seem deeply mature. Has anyone ever met someone like that? Like you're a lot older than what you should be, like you're emotionally and just psychologically, they're more mature. So we can grasp that concept, right? We've known people that are physically older, but emotionally seem a lot younger, and vice versa. So in this chapter, when Joanna talks about maturity and psychological maturity, I don't want us, and I don't believe Joanna wants us to use this information to look at other people and go, oh, that person's psychologically immature. Oh, that person needs to grow up. They have a lot of learning to do. That's never the intent of Joanna DeAngelis. Quite the opposite. It is a roadmap, if you will, to guide ourselves through our personal journey. So, okay, bring it down to layman's terms. Who's ever started a new job? At some point, everybody's had some form of a job that's new to them, right? At some point in their life, whether professional or otherwise. So sometimes in the professional arena, you tend to have like a resource book. Like your boss might say, oh, here's a resource to know a little bit like how to do your job. Right? Hopefully your job has that. So in life, I like to think of these books as resources of how to live our lives. In this particular book, which is in the back, I don't see Daniel, so I don't know where he went out to, and he has my book, but it's in the laptop bag, Jeanette. So in this book, it's the same thing. Joanna guides us. God bless you, thank you. Times of Health and Conscientiousness, where she tackles a multitude of different topics, one of which are largely, these are psychological and emotionally, it's from that perspective. Of course, always with the spiritist perspective in mind. So when she talks about maturity and conscientiousness, ultimately, what she wants us to do is to reach these things, to reach maturity, And conscientiousness is just another way, a pretty fancy way of saying just being more aware, more self-aware. So I wanted to break it down in this, using this sort of, this puzzle, as you can see here, because we are ultimately puzzling. We are complex individuals. Are we not? So the way in which we break down, there are many different parts of us. But we want to break down Joanna's message in the following way. The psychological process of evolution and maturity, as she calls it. The psychological immaturity, and the expression of psychological maturation. So I wanted to touch on this first. So we're going to go not super fast, but not spend a whole lot of time here, because we do have a slide closer towards the end that I would like us to spend more time on, which will be this slide. So when you guys see it, you're like, oh, it's time for me to talk. Yeah, it's not me, you guys. I'm going to be asking questions. Ooh. Yeah, there we go. So I share this so you can already be thinking about what lies ahead for you all, for us. When we talk about psychological maturity and conscientiousness, what does that look like? What does that feel like? And what are some of the examples when we talk about this? So keep that in mind as we're talking about this, because I want to get those cogwheels moving in your brain. So Joanna says, psychological process of evolution and maturity. She says it's this: continuous striving. Actually, you know what? I'm going to have someone read. Leo, can you give the mic to some kind volunteer who would like to read? If not, I'll pick on someone. Bia. It's only because I only know but so many people's names, so.
Continue striving for self-knowledge and the courage to face oneself, working inwardly to overcome the limitations and infantile process that still predominate.
What does that mean? And that's not just for Bia, all of us. What does that mean? Continuous striving for self-knowledge and the courage to face oneself. Working inwardly to overcome the limitations and infantile processes that still predominate. This is about us. This is about what we do to reach this process of psychological maturity. Getting to know ourselves, absolutely. Yeah. Has anyone ever began that process of getting to know yourself and you felt scared? Yeah, please.
So one of the things that comes to mind is like, I shouldn't say that it's easy. It's not easy, but analyzing oneself is a step, and sometimes we conquer that. But the problem is to face it and to say, okay, what do I do with this? Well, it's much like, okay, I was given the opportunity to receive a gift. What do I do with this now, right? And I'm saying this in a positive way because sometimes it may not be received as a gift. It can be viewed as a threat, right? Because it's a problem that we have.
Absolutely. And I think Joanna doesn't mince words when she says the courage to face oneself. In my limited capacity and limited understanding, when she says the courage to face oneself, well, if she's saying courage, it's because it must take courage to truly face and admit who we are. And if we haven't yet felt that, perhaps maybe we haven't begun to break down our own inner walls and really reach that point where it's like we really have to face who we are. So I'll give you a quick example of this, and we're going to go to the next one. So if you've ever been in a relationship and you get into an argument, it can be any kind of relationship, male, female, male, whatever. You get into a relationship with someone and you fully believe in something, okay? And this person says to you the opposite. And you're like, no, eggs are white. And they're saying eggs are brown. But you and everything you've ever learned in your entire life and all of the experiences you've ever learned and up until that moment in your life, eggs were white to you. But here you have someone who you're in a relationship with, and they're telling you eggs are brown. Now, it doesn't matter what the reality is, whether they're brown or they're white. In actuality, they're an array of colors. But here you're faced with someone who you love and care about, and they're telling you something opposite to what you believe. So you can have two choices. You can fight to the death and say, well, eggs are white, and that's the end of it. Or you can take a step back and look at the big picture. And then look at yourself and go, maybe they're not white. Maybe it's me who saw them as white all these years. And that becomes scary. Why? Because then you rethink everything you've ever thought about that particular subject and all the things that it's related to. So you begin to have to question. And that's something that we don't like to do as human beings. We don't like to look at ourselves and go, oh, I was wrong. Men never have this issue. This is solely a female problem. Completely, right? I jest. What's that? Eggs are white. But that feeling of like, oh my gosh, maybe they were never white. Maybe they really are other colors. So it forces us to look at ourselves, and it is scary. So she says, psychological maturity, immaturity. She says it's not characteristic of the childhood development period only, but of different stages of life. Meaning, we are not only psychologically immature when we're physically young, but also when we are other ages. Considering the fact that learning and growth never stop until the moment of individuation, when the spirit takes control of matter and the mental remains in harmony with the physical. And we kind of talked about this already. She goes on further talking about psychological immaturity. She says, unable to overcome frustrations, they let them take root in the unconscious, and become their victim. And they resort to mechanisms of irresponsibility every time they find themselves grappling with difficulties and confrontations. So today, my 5-year-old come down the steps this morning. My husband gets up with the kids and come down the steps this morning, and my 5-year-old was trying to explain to me in his 5-year-old brain a game. And he's saying, Mommy, he says, Mommy, it's this game that I want. And it goes, do, ba, 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 ba. And I'm like, okay. So I'm trying to like think, because parenthood, half of it is deciphering what these kids are what they're trying to say. So we spend, I don't know, maybe an hour back and forth, myself, my husband. We're all trying to figure out which game this is. We go through the App Store. We go through his iPad. And his reaction, he begins to throw a tantrum. He's like crying as if someone, just hurt him. I mean, like, I even became worried, like, oh my gosh, the neighbors might hear this. So he's crying, he's screaming, he's throwing a tantrum. And he really could not deal with his own emotions and his frustration. So when I think about when Joanna says, unable to overcome frustrations, resorting to mechanisms of irresponsibility every time they find themselves grappling with difficulties and confrontations. So looking at my 5-year-old and his 5-year-old brain, and it wasn't just him throwing a tantrum, it was everything that was happening during those moments. And something we've noticed when he's still trying to deal with big emotions. And then I was thinking about Joanna, what she was saying. How much in our lives do we also act like this? Maybe not as openly and blatant, like rolling around on the ground, but maybe in our minds, not accepting the things that are happening to us, around us, within us. So we resort to not dealing with it at all. But she pivots back to psychological maturation, which is psychological maturity. And she reminds us that the spirit is the agent of life. Individuals' mechanism for psychological maturation is expressed in a natural way, awaiting their will and continuous effort to acknowledge their physical, emotional, and other weaknesses, providing motivation to correct and overcome them. So how do we support our 5-year-old when he's going through these moments? So we say, acknowledge your emotions. This is, I'm oversimplifying this, okay? So he'll say, I'm frustrated. Like, oh, yeah, I can see it. I get it. Be frustrated too. You want something, can't provide it. It's kind of life. Life happens like that. You're going to get frustrated. Sorry. And my husband always says, what is it he says in Portuguese? Reencarnação, meu filho. It's a reincarnation. This is life. It's going to happen. We have to learn how to manage it. You know, we're going to have frustrations in life. So sometimes just calling a spade is helpful. So to say, you know what, I'm really frustrated right now. And that's when Joanna, in part, when she says, acknowledging our physical, emotional, and weaknesses and providing motivation to correct them and overcome them. So we have this option. So there are two major characters or people in history we can look at as it pertains to Christianity. We can look at Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and he felt the weight of that guilt. But what did he do? Does anyone know what happened to Peter after Jesus died? Like the rest of his life, what happened to him? What is Peter most known for? He founded the Catholic Church. He worked really hard. So who knows the story of Judas Iscariot? Hold on now, before we go judging Judas, hold on now. Who's ever read the book Boa Nova, or Good News? It's now in English. You need to read that book because they give such an amazing account of the story of Judas. So Judas, by historical context, what we know in Christianity, not in Spiritism, but within Christianity, is that Judas betrayed Jesus, right? And what happened to Judas after that? He committed suicide. Mm-hmm. Yep. He could not, in his mind, handle what he had done, so he took his life. And so the majority of Christianity looks at him as a traitor. But Humberto de Campos, or Brother X, in the book Boa Nova, does a phenomenal job of re-educating us and letting us know it wasn't that so much that Judas betrayed Jesus. It was that in Judas's mind, he thought, because he had knowledge of politics and all these things, so he thought, oh, Jesus just needs a good PR person. He needs some public relations. He needs to be, to really be out there and be noticed. So In Judas's mind, he thought, oh, well, I'm going to, give him up to the authorities, but it's going to draw so much attention that everybody's going to know the gospel. And that's how the message is going to, really go far. That's what he thought. In his heart of hearts, that's what he believed. But we all know what happened. Everyone in Christianity blames Judas for Jesus being crucified or being the catalyst. And Judas, realizing what he had done, he could not stand the weight, took his life. Does anybody know what Jesus did after he was crucified? He didn't immediately ascend all the way back up to the higher spheres. Do we know it was the first act of Jesus when he, let's say, disconnected from his physical body? Does anybody know? The first thing he did was he went to rescue Judas. This is an account from Spiritist literature. It's not in biblical text anywhere, obviously. But he went to rescue Judas and to hold him and cradle him in his arms to bring him comfort. So we mention these two stories, Judas and Peter, because they are a great example of the two options we have in life. Both of them, we could say, betrayed Jesus, committed some actions that they deeply regretted, but one chose to go one route and take his own life, and the other, Peter, dedicated the rest of his life of disseminating the gospel. Now, what became of it afterward is a whole other story we're not going to get into. But for Peter and for other disciples and apostles, Peter made a choice. He acknowledged what he did. He knew that it was not good and he felt horrible for denying Jesus. But he lived the rest of his life till the day that he died. And does anyone know how Peter died? So, was that his choice or did they do that to him? The position was his choice. So he did not want to be crucified upright. Thank you. English, Portuguese. So he didn't feel that he wanted to die the same way the master did. He said, no, I want to die upside down. And for those of you who've read Humberto de Campos and a lot of the other literature in Spiritism, we come to know that up until those moments before he was put to death, he was exuding the gospel. Like if we could have a microscope in those days and get a special microscope and just see all of the love pouring out of him. It was always there. So I digress. We have a choice. Psychological immaturity or maturity. Now, what's important to note, and we'll go to our next, go to the next slide, is that Joanna's not here, and Spiritism for that matter is not here to make us feel bad about where we are at on this vast scale. There might be parts of you that are immature and other parts that are more mature. It's not for us to go and feel and ruminate as Judas did, but do like Peter did. So you know what? This is where I'm at. Let me focus on trying being better. As Joanna says, motivation to correct and to overcome our physical, emotional, and other weaknesses. She goes on to talk about the psychic functions, and she always, generally, will refer back to Carl Gustav Jung, the famous, I want to say Swedish psychologist, psychiatrist, well known in the field of psychology. She says the following: the psychic functions, which Jung, who's pictured here down below, classified as being four: sensory, emotional, intellectual, and intuitive. I'm bringing a very high level overview. We could spend hours talking about this or not. Just as a sidebar, for those of you who might know the subject more in depth, I don't mean to do it a disservice. Joanna goes on to say, the psychic functions, which Jung classified as being four: sensory, emotional, intellectual, intuitive, should form a harmonious whole without the predominance of one over the others, providing maturation, therefore conscientiousness. So living our lives utilizing these four psychic functions: thinking, intuition, feeling, sensation. Wording might be slightly different, but it's the same thing, essentially. So thinking meaning, in our everyday lives, analyzing information, drawing conclusions, making decisions based on logic and reason. Intuition, using our intuition, perceiving patterns and connections in information and generating possibilities for the future. Feelings, or emotions, or feelings. Evaluating information based on personal values and emotions, making decisions that are congruent with those values. And lastly, but not leastly, sensation. Experiencing the world through senses and gathering information about the physical environment. Why is this important? So these are four aspects of how we experience life. So sometimes we are on one part of this pie than the other. Sometimes we are more so, we are thinkers, we use our frontal lobe, we are more objective, the way we look at things. Generally, historically, men tend to be thinkers. Not always, everyone's different, but sometimes. Whereas sometimes women, not always, but sometimes, historically, can be known as more so in the feeling range, where we rely on our feelings, our intuition. So, but what Jung and what Joanna's pointing out is that the perfect balance lies within these four. To have a balance between logic and emotion, intuition, and just normal sensing. And notice how Joanna says here, without the predominance of one over the others, meaning without having too much, using too much of just intuition or just feeling or just thinking. There has to be an even keel balance of how we are viewing and experiencing life. Again, this is for us to take back, to analyze and think about, how do I process things? How do I process conversations? How do I process experiences in my mind? Because how I'm processing these things then leads to whatever actions I'm going to do. So I'll give you an example. When our daughter was in her early teenage years, and in my mind, I always was going by my feeling, I would say, more than my intuition, my feeling and my sensation of things. And luckily, I have a spouse that in that moment, I don't want to overhype him or anything because he has his imperfections. In that moment, he seemed to be much more in tune with all four of these. And he was able to pick up on something that I wasn't. And I really was like, buddy, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm the mother. I have motherly intuition. Perfect example of like, let's be open. Other people can see things you might not see. And much to my dismay, and then I had to swallow really hard to say, hey, you're right. You're right. So it's this even balance between these things. Joanna goes on, talking about psychological maturity. saying that it's expressed when one loves, when one reaches that self-giving sentiment, showing liberation from infantilism. And on the other end of the spectrum, she says, psychological immaturity is egocentric and ambitious. The child, the Jungian concept of the child, which we'll talk about here in 1 second, the child clings to ownership and does not give. It demands to be protected, but never protects. It receives love, but does not know how to express it. Its love is possessive and is always expressed in receiving, in taking. The child loves 100% in the present. And as long as love doesn't feel the pleasure of giving, it is still in the infantile period, characterized by jealousy, insecurity, unreasonable demands, and is thus self-centered and inappropriate. Whereas the opposite, the adult, again, not the adult as we understand it, but the Jungian concept, again, we'll talk about here in a second. The adult, on the other hand, understands that love is the science and art of giving, of bringing happiness to others. Its time reference is the future, which the present builds step by step to the degree that effectivity and the psyche mature. So when Joanna talks about the child and the adult from the Jungian concept, we found something to kind of explain that as best we could here. And it's this, basically what we kind of talked about earlier. So the adult ego state is when the behaviors we have, thoughts and feelings are direct responses to the here and now. And the child ego state are behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that are replayed from childhood. So I can be a biological adult, but live with this childlike ego state. I could be a biological child and have an adult ego state. And this is what Joanna says in her more eloquent ways. She says, hence, it is not surprising that adults may hold on to childish behaviors, whereas young people may demonstrate balanced maturity. Remember the slide I said at the beginning? Who remembers it? Dun, 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 dun. Remember I said, guys, look out for the slide. This is going to mean this is where your participation comes in. But before, I'll give you a break. Hold on. Who has read the book? Read. It's a textbook, really. Who has ever read or studied Heaven and Hell? Okay, few of you, okay. It's a really excellent book, and there actually are, in the book, there's actual cases of sad spirits, happy spirits that have passed on. So there's one particular case of a child who dies. And the child gives a communication after postmortem, after he passes away goes back to the spirit realm. But just a little background, before this child died, he was a very old soul. He died very young from a childhood ailment. And even as he was dying, and for those of you who are parents, you gotta try to imagine this. As he was in the bed, actively dying, he was comforting his parents who were weeping. He said, don't worry, Mom and Dad. Life goes on. I'm not dying. It's just my physical vessel. I'll see you guys later. But the parents, distraught, crying, hysterical as he's clearly passing, until his last breath, he was comforting those at his deathbed. Fast forward some time, he communicates and he shares his experience. If you want to know more about it, I forget the name of the chapter, but it proves this point that Joanna is bringing. Here you have this young child. It's so incredibly spiritually mature. Communicates later a message to I think it's the Spiritist Society of Paris, that he knew and agreed before he reincarnated that he was going to have this type of problem in his physical body. He knew it. It was planned. He needed it. He was aware of it. He accepted it. And he just wanted his parents to live their life and be happy. So here you have this, let's say, 8-year-old. Physically, you think an 8-year-old can have this level of maturity. But it just goes to show you we can be a lot older psychologically and emotionally. So Joanna shares all this. So why does she share all this? Why does she want us to know and understand the distinction between psychological maturity and immaturity? Why does she say all those things? And before we begin to ask questions, there's a phrase in the chapter that we wanted to share. She says, mature elderly persons feel fulfilled through ongoing experiences of love, beneficial cultural, emotional, and social experiences free of the past and meaningless memories. So when she talks about mature persons, doesn't necessarily mean, again, biological. But people who are emotionally mature have these ongoing experiences of love, beneficial cultural, emotional, and social experiences, free of the past and meaningless memories. So it seems as though this is something to be obtained. But the question is, and we always ask, so why is she telling us this? What's the purpose? What does she want? Like, what's the take-home message here? How do I go home and live life utilizing this information? So what would it look like? And these are the questions I'm posing to you all. For those of you who may be watching on the web as well, feel free to drop your feedback, comments, even questions in the chat online. What does it look like for you to live this ongoing experiences of love, emotional and social experiences free of the past and meaningless memories? If you could live your best life, what would that look like? And I'm not talking about living like people in Hollywood do with lots and loads of money. Because clearly, if we see what's happening in Hollywood, they're not very happy. I know some people might disagree with that, but they're not very happy. So, but what would that look like to live a life where we are fulfilled? So I posed a question out to you guys. Anyone, any brave soul, I'm going to call somebody. I'll give you a second to think about that. So I gave the example. So to me, what it looks like is living a balanced person, someone who is living ongoing experiences of life, as someone who seems very, balanced. Or if I envision myself, I'm just like a tranquil person. But there's no wrong answer. It can look like any variety of things. Jeanette.
I don't know what I'm gonna say. Like I said, it's not right or wrong, but I feel like I have maturity. I feel it. But even though I got in the time that technology goes so fast, and I didn't have time to to catch it, to learn what I supposed to learn. And I can be very frustrated when I start to do something I'm not able to do. And sometimes I can cry because, we cannot do it. You want to do it. And sometimes feeling happy to me is be able to be like, breathe and try to do it and do it. And when I decide not to do it, like, no, I'm going to give up. I'm not happy. I think, try to leave the frustration aside and try to do the best as I can. Not going to be perfect. And do my best to do it.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeanette. Daniel?
I just want to read from our friend from Australia. She says, it would like having all my loved ones saved, health, and content with their lives.
Thank you, Melanie from Australia. Anybody else?
One thing that catches my attention with this is actually the free of the past and meaningless memory. So is to live every moment, learn from it, and try to make it of as much as possible a meaningful, right? Whether it's difficult or not. So to be in the moment, because whenever we allow ourselves to be caught up in the past, we don't move forward.
Great. Next question. What does it... Oh, no, go ahead. No. Go ahead. Please share, Diana.
No, I was going to say the same thing as he said. I think the memories and, sometimes get us trapped in experience and we just can't move on, and maturity, I think it's that. I can see, not on me, but I can see people that goes through so many things in their lives and they can go through it and they can be so resilient and mature to go on with their lives and feel the pain or the challenges in a different form.
Can we give the Agnes, please?
I think it's kind of similar to what everyone's saying. To me, when I think about it, it's almost like a feeling of contentment, being content. Like even though we have like the ups and downs in life, but you still appreciate where you are, appreciate what you have. And it reminded me of a phrase that I actually heard this week. I was watching something on a talk, and the lady said that we tend to look for happiness, right? And they said like happiness depends on what is happening, but joy, like we should try to look for joy, because joy is like any state that you have within. So go through the days, and when I think about this, it's almost like I want to get to that point, like just to feel this joy through experiences, regardless of what's happening, still try to keep in mind that we are learning and we have come far. So not attached to the past, like people are saying, so like not be stuck in, oh, I should have done better, I should or shouldn't. So just accept, learn, and keep moving forward.
Perfect. Yeah. And that kind of segues perfectly into what would that feel like? And so Agnes shares that feelings of joy, just that feeling, that ability. And I would also add in my own flavor and say, I always think of St. Francis of Assisi, because the way that Joanna talks about him is so highly. And she says that St. Francis, he lived looking at, he lived his life looking at everything as if everything was enchanting and magical and amazing. And when I think about what it feels like, I think about that similar joy he must have experienced in all moments and all aspects of his life. Like for those of you who know his little bit of his I think it's his story, if I'm not confusing with somebody else. He had cataracts at one point, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it was him. He had cataracts at one point, and at that time, the way they treated cataracts, they kind of would just like burn your eye, and of course, it made him blind. So as they're going through this process of burning his eye, and he becomes right. Am I missing the story? Okay. He's like, "Oh, God bless you," like brother fire, you know. And I think about that. Let's think about that for a second, right? Let's say you are him and you're about to be blinded because that's the way that they treated that ailment at that time. Do we bless the fire that burns us? Has anybody ever done that? I haven't. No, I've never done that. Gioni says, yeah, they wouldn't. Gioni said she'd be throwing hands. Okay, she'd be throwing hands. They wouldn't reach her second eye. So, but it's something to aspire to. Have any of you ever watched the Disney movie Cinderella? Just one person? Oh, okay. Oh, well, I'm asking the question, you guys. Yes, okay. So, long time ago. Okay, if you haven't watched in a while, despite some feelings about Disney, but if you haven't watched that movie in a while, go back and watch it again. And the reason why I say this, because whenever I think about St. Francis, I think about Cinderella. And there's many parts in the movies where, in the story, where she gets up from her bed and she starts singing to the birds, and the birds come to her window. And then the mice in the house come and they help build like a dress for her because she's poor. So she's always like in tune with the animals. And St. Francis was that way. Everything was magical, very Disney-like, in the best sense of the word. So which leads us to this as we wrap up shortly here. How do we get there? How do we get to be like St. Francis, to have those feelings of joy, to actually exude and to live our lives this way? What do we do to get there? What's that? Get to know yourself? If we were to break that down, what would that look like, getting to know myself?
Accepting your weaknesses.
Okay.
And I think when you get to see what you're doing wrong or right, you get power. So you feel responsible. So you are going to acknowledge that, in fact, what can be scary in the beginning can be very powerful at the end, because you can decide how to handle stuff. So, and if you just hide, then you are always like going through the, through the corners, not facing stuff that, when you get to know yourself, you're going to say, well, I'm very nice at this, but I need to improve that. And that gives you power. So you're going to acknowledge that you are, in fact, much happier than you could have ever imagined. Because if you face the truth will make you happier, stronger, and you're going to see, it's not that bad. I can do this. I can mend this. I can help that person that I take pity on her. But maybe if I help her, she's going to be smiling a little bit more, or she's going to be treating people more because I'll accept her.
Mm-hmm.
Or you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe that's the key, I think, when you get older. And even when you're young.
Yes. At any age, we can do this. Jeanette, go ahead.
Probably silly, but I'm gonna say anyway. When I go to look at my wallet, there's not money there, and look at my bills, not bills in there. My bill, to pay is a lot to pay, and I see I have to work. I have to change myself. I have to make myself better because I have to. I cannot be waiting anyone else. It's myself. I am the one who have to change myself because otherwise I'm not going to accomplish the things I'm supposed to. And yeah, that's the way I see.
Thank you, Jeanette. There's no wrong answers.
So
go ahead.
one thing that crosses my mind in terms in relation to this idea of getting to know myself, it's like the losing your key effect. And what do? We trace it back. I was here, there, right? So then most of the time it leads back to that what we're looking for. And I try to do this with not often, folks. I'm not perfect at this, but I try to do this with thoughts and
Okay, your
feelings.
wife's sitting behind you. We can confirm. Go ahead.
Yes, she will tell me, tell us, by the way. So I try to do that with thoughts and feelings, and one will lead to the other most of the time. Most of the time, the thoughts that are crossing our hearts and our minds will lead to the reason why, which is usually the feeling, right, or vice versa. So sometimes certain things comes to mind, or a person or a situation, and I like to ask myself, why did I think of this? What is leading me to think, bless you, to think A, B, C, right? And then you can trace it back and say, oh, this is what is triggering that thought, bless you. So I think to me, this is something that helps. Sometimes I have to let it be and just be with that thought and be with that feeling because of not having the ability to deal with it right at that moment. But it's something that at least helps me to say, oh, yeah, this happened before. And if it becomes reoccurring, then it's definitely something that, a pointer that something needs to happen, right?
Excellent point. Absolutely. Which kind of summarizes this, right? Characteristics of a self-actualized person. And self-actualization is a term that comes from a lot of psychology, specifically Maslow, who was a great theorist, psychologist, amongst many other things. Basically, self-actualize is when you reach the epitome, the apex of who we aspire to be, like our best selves. So these would be the characteristics: self-accepting, open and spontaneous, realistic, responsible, enjoys the journey, not the destination, autonomous, enjoys solitude and privacy, just to name a few things. But Joanna she ties everything in a nice bow by ending the chapter, always, as she always does, bringing it back to Jesus and reminding us something that Jesus said. When Jesus said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." That's in John 13:34. And why does Jesus say that? What is it about loving others that's so psychologically good for us? It's so much more complex than just the phrase of, oh, Jesus told me that we have to love one another. Love thy neighbor. Well, because it's a commandment, it's what Jesus said we have to do, but it's actually much more on a deeper, complex level from a psychological standpoint. When we are good to others, when we're able to love others as Jesus had loved us, of course, we're not going to get it perfect all the time, but there's something in that when we stop to think less about ourselves and think more about and the well-being of my neighbor, that things shift as individuals, as societies. And to close out, Joanna mentions question 893 in the Spirit's book, and she shares part of the answer. She says, in the Spirit's book from Kardec and the Good Spirits, they say, all virtues are meritorious because all are signs of progress on the path of the good. However, the highest virtue consists in the sacrifice of one's own interests for the good of one's neighbor without ulterior motives. The greatest merit is that which is based on the most disinterested charity. Thus, Joanna finishes this chapter saying, It is through self-knowledge that thinking individuals become aware of their own imperfections. They work on them and lead by gregarious need. They exit loneliness and begin to love. So thank you all so much. And again, this is from this particular book. If you're wanting to purchase some online, it's an excellent book to read. I'll stop here. I'm about 7 minutes over. For any questions or comments, Leo, I'll give it to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten, for this beautiful message and the study of it, this chapter, right? And helping us take a step towards maturity. And Joanna De Angelis as well, obviously. So we have comments and questions online, but we would like to also open for our questions and comments here. And I will just read some of our hellos real quick so we can get ourselves prepared here. Hello from Heavy Horse, but we know it's Melanie from Australia. Good morning from Australia. And we have some other comments as well and questions. I would like to, Alba actually comment on Peter by saying, Peter was the founder of the first mention of the way, serving those in need. It was a revolutionary concept as charity institutions did not exist at them.
I'm sorry. Hold on one second. Technical stuff. Okay. Yes? Make full screen? Okay, because I was going to put the comments. Okay. All right. Let me just hide this real quick.
That's it.
Oh, no. Hold on. Sorry. I just want to move this out of the way.
Just don't move it, and then it will disappear.
Oh, don't move it. Don't disappear. Okay. Peter was the founder of the first Mansion of the Way, serving those in need. It was a revolutionary concept as charity institutions. Yes, absolutely, Alba. It was definitely revolutionary at that time.
Then we have a question by Paula. And Paula asks, why is it so difficult for people with low self-esteem to accept their weaknesses and not ruminate on them, especially as they usually want to grow?
That's a fantastic question. Why is it so difficult for people? What comes to mind is something in the gospel, according to Spiritism, they share with us, is that pride, our pride, is what keeps us furthest from God. Because it also keeps us furthest from our own self and being able to look at ourselves. That sense of pride we carry from one lifetime to many lifetimes. That sense of, I don't want to accept that I have this weakness, that I'm less than what I really am. And this is why I truly believe Joanna says it takes courage to face ourselves. Because it's not easy to truly look ourselves in the mirror, not solely in a physical sense, but really looking at our soul, our behaviors, and not get stuck on them as Judas did, and many others, many of us, we get stuck on thinking about them over, and Joanna talks about this in other books, that we ruminate like a loop. It keeps going, like we kind of get stuck in this loop of fixating on our own negative vices, our own missteps, or our own weaknesses. We can't get out of it. We can, if we choose to, but we get into this habit. So I would say, this is a very complex question, but largely I would say in part it'd be pride, our own pride. To let that go and to be able to still acknowledge that we are a child of God. I still have worth, even if I'm imperfect. Thank you, Paula, for your question.
Thank you, Kirsten. Anyone here would like to ask a question? So we'll move on then, and then Paul, actually, I'm sorry, Alba says, in terms of when we were discussing on working on ourselves, she says part of working on ourselves imply to reach out to help. As an example, psychological therapy, counseling, coaching, etc.
Absolutely. And it cannot be understated that going to see a therapist should be the same as when we go to our dentist every 6 months. It really shouldn't be any different. There is a cultural stigma. I don't think it's just in the US. I think it's worldwide largely. When we talk about mental health or psychological health, it's looked down on. People don't really want to, I mean, as much as we have grown in that arena, most people have no problem saying, oh, I went to the cardiologist, I had to get checked out, had to have whatever, my stress test done. People say, oh yeah, I went to the dentist the other day, they found a cavity. We don't in that same breath say the same thing. Oh, I went to my therapist the other day, because as soon as you utter, I went to a therapist, both ourselves and others may go, ooh, are you a little nutty? You got a problem? Are you a little bit crazy? But there really, hopefully with time and as we evolve, that changes. But thank you, Alba, for that.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Alba. We have a question from Sarah, but well, let's go to Sarah's question because it's a really nice question. I do have a question as well. If we have time, I'll ask later. Sarah says the following: great talk. Here's a question from me. We know, Sarah, it's from you. I'm just joking with her. When does a lack of one's ego become self-indulgence?
Wow. Hold on. When does a lack of one's ego become self-indulgence? When does a lack? Oh, I think you stumped me. When does a lack? I think this is payback. This is my daughter. She's 22.
I can see her jumping on the other side now.
When does
got
a
her.
lack? Like, got him. When does a lack of one's ego become self-indulgence? I don't know if I understand the question. Are you asking, Sarah, as I'm sure you're still watching, are you asking when is it not the ego and when is it self-indulgent? Or Leo, do you understand this question any better? Or Daniel, can you decipher? Translate?
You say yeah, so you know your daughter better than I know my niece, but
So, what's the opposite of the ego? Is the self, right? So, as we increase our self psychology, so then we tend to become more self-indulgent, right? Because now the ego has to do more with the selfishness way, right? And that's what I think. I mean, like, it's self-indulgence mean like be more kind with ourselves, right? Indulgence, self-indulgence, right? Indulgence, more indulgence than indulgence, sugar, like sweet, right? More kind with ourselves, right? That's, I think, what she's asking. Like, our ego not always is, sometimes we are too harsh on ourselves, and that is the ego. You know, we don't want to, for example, if we make mistake, instead of be kind of ourselves, the ego can like be harsh on ourselves, right? So what she asks is like, okay, if I commit a crime, instead of be guilt, how can I be a little bit more patient for myself? I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah.
I did text her asking for some clarification, right? And she just said he's right. So she just confirmed he's right.
So, okay, so the question is, when is it not so much? So when is it not? Yeah. when is it okay? So still with some reluctance to answer this because I think I still don't fully understand her question. But let me just state this. So the ego is not the enemy. Very important. Let me get there. So the ego is not the enemy. The ego, in the context of when in psychology it gets a bad rap, the ego has its part. It has its job. The problem is that when the ego takes over and we don't allow we don't allow ourselves to go deeper. So if you ever heard the phrase, I think Leo used to use this phrase a lot. He hasn't in a while, like, oh, the old man inside of me. It's kind of like that ego part of me that wants to always prevail, even though there are other deeper parts of me that want to succeed and do better. So I think the question is it about Sarah? Thank you. When is it okay to become self-indulgent? Because even the word self-indulgence, go ahead.
I was trying to understand here too, and I believe that her question could be when we were talking about the pride on the previous question. If you interpret, use the word pride in there, right? If you don't have a pride, no, I don't think that becomes self-indulgence. Yeah. Uh, my understanding of the question was that sometimes you people wanted to do everything you want, and then sometimes a big ego, right? And you keep doing things and you don't want to recognize. It goes back to that part of recognizing when you're wrong to make the changes. Lots of the times, even when you have the intention to make the changes, you don't stop to think, either because of pride or because you have the ego, or you're surrounded by people that are giving you bad examples or bad influences, and then it doesn't allow you to make the changes that are necessary for you to live better and reach maturity. So that's the
That makes
understanding I
sense.
had.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Agnes, did you want to add to that?
I just want to say what's coming to my mind. Maybe would be. I think I see these questions maybe like there is a fine line when you are like fulfilling your ego and when you are like self-indulging. So like I see the word that comes to my mind is boundary. So a lot of times like we act on the ego is almost like fulfilling this pride, this feeling of like the outer ego, like you want to be better than others, you want to feel this rush of like I'm doing the best. And then there is the part that when you need to be a little selfish for yourself, is putting boundaries to protect yourself, to protect your being. It's not just like doing everything for everybody, but then you realize there are people abusing your kindness, and then you need to protect yourself a little bit, to put in some boundaries. So I don't know if maybe that's where the question is coming from, but that's what came to my mind, that the difference maybe is when you're fulfilling your ego for this feeling of superiority, and then the self-indulgence maybe is a little bit of taking care of yourself, so putting boundaries to protect yourself in the part of like the selfishness of protecting yourself, thinking of you as well.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think there's generally this battle between when is it okay for me to say, no, that doesn't serve me? And when is that ego? And when is that me protecting myself and creating a boundary? And I, as my limited understanding, and I would say that each individual has to know or make that decision for themselves. I can't necessarily go and turn to you and say, oh, it's your ego, or no, this is selfishness. It is a self-discovery we must do in ourselves to make the distinction. And the more we get to know ourselves, if we really sit with that personal question, we'll be able to answer eventually.
Thank you. I'll just say a comment real quick by Melanie again, and then I'll finalize with Alba's question. Same here in Australia. If you go to see a therapist, you are nutty or broken and often scoffed at and made fun of. So I guess it's human nature right around the world.
Yeah.
So thank you for the comment, and
Yeah. Thanks, Melanie.
you're not alone.
Yeah.
Right?
I think it speaks to because it is an area where we are scared. I think it's an area where, because nobody, somewhere inside of us, in our psyche, in our minds, when we think about mental health, we're scared to look at our own selves. So it's easier for us to, in a way, put up that barrier and say, oh, that person's nutty, because the reality is we haven't yet faced ourselves. Because when we do begin to truly do our own personal work, we don't have that perspective. But thank you, Melanie.
And then finally, Alba says, some of us are the product of a get it right on the first the time we try. Otherwise, you are a failure. What will be the first steps to accept our failures and imperfections?
I realize there's a level of complexity to this question because it's deeply rooted in us, in our own feelings of, when we are disgusted or with ourselves, or we are just, we don't like that we have failed. So there's a level of complexity to it. And I don't want to oversimplify this and give a simple answer, but it's a decision. It truly is a decision. And Peter and Judas were faced with this decision. Either I'm going to accept what I've done and my imperfections and look at myself as this doesn't define who I am. It was a part of my story, but it doesn't have to define who I always will be. So that's up to us to speak that narrative to ourselves. I can either allow this to be who I am, and that's it, or I can open up my mind and say, well, these were some things that happened that I chose. It didn't end well. Got to move on. I don't want to say that it's as simple as that, because it's not, because we are very complex individuals, and we carry with us a lot of emotional baggage and traumas. But taking that step to looking at ourselves as children of God, that we are worthy of happiness, that we are worthy of joy, despite what we've done. Jesus, after he discarnated on the cross, one of the very first things he wanted to make sure that he went right to Judas to assure Judas, look, you are loved. Doesn't matter, what happened. Those weren't his words, but he wanted to assure him that he was loved, independent of the decisions he made. So we are loved despite it all, despite ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more time? No, we're actually close, so we're good, close to the time. So thank you, Kirsten, and congratulations stirring up all these complex questions. It was well worth it to stir up all these questions. We know when we give a talk, it can be daunting sometimes, but when we give a talk, when we speak of something, right, that it really stirs up our feelings, our thoughts, and makes us think. So thank you for that. It is interesting that we close this up. It is interesting that we come to these moments expecting one or two things, which is okay to expect, right? And we come to realize that it's way beyond what we expected. So thank you for that. And thank you, Joanna De Angelis, for this work as well. And hopefully we can take that with us and find some consolation in terms of maturity within. Kirsten said something really interesting at the beginning, is that perhaps we're not mature fully, right, in every single aspect of our lives, right? But we have some level of maturity in some areas, especially. And one of the things that we can perhaps try is to a term that we use perhaps in in business is that portability, right? You have that skill, and guess what? You take that skill and apply some in some other areas that perhaps is a little bit different, but you take that skill that you have and then you apply in that area. And I think it can be done the same thing, the same way with our maturity. Mature in one area, let's go ahead and apply someplace else, right? Perhaps we have the responsibility that led us there, and we can utilize that skill to develop something else. On that note, if we're still confused, if we're still stirred up, it's okay. Let us work together for our passes now. We would like to ask Daniel for us to put the music so we can say a short prayer. I'll ask Jeanette to turn off the light, and then we will be called to the front for us to receive the passes.